Okay, so this is my presentation for the final week of the unit and the final section of Hume's book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. I hope the audio is okay. Hope you guys can hear all right. So in the final section, section 12, Hume's kind of bringing everything home now from what we've been discussing and what we've been looking at so far. And he seems to end in a position of conceded doubt. In terms of, he spent a lot of the book sort of disavowing us of any notion that our capacity for reason provides us with a solid grounding for knowledge. So he's spoken a lot about this idea of our assumption of causal necessity or causal connection as existing in the world, as being something that when we analyze it is really based on what is only a conjunction between similar events. So it's an assumption that we make, and this assumption isn't based on reason, it's an instinct. So there's no rational justification for our claims about the world, which puts us in a sea of doubt kind of situation. We're kind of up in the air now, and it's something that I found quite kind of unsatisfying by the end. I kept sort of hoping that Hume would pull a rabbit out of the hat and give us some kind of way of better according our understanding of the world and better. But unlike Descartes sort of claimed to eventually reach some kind of self-evident solid truth from which we could deduce knowledge from. Descartes rejects the possibility of this. We just can't do it. So this is the traditional reading of Hume, that he is a radical skeptic, that even about a radical skeptic about capacity for any knowledge, and certainly even about causality, and particularly about causality. He's spent quite a long time sort of dismantling this notion of causal connection or causal necessity in objects, and sort of saying, well, actually, we have no basis to make such a claim. There is some tension, though, throughout the book, I found anyway, in that sometimes when Hume's talking, he seems to be committed to an assumption, these assumptions, and committed to this idea that there is an underlying regularity of nature. So particularly, when he's discussing free will, and he seems to really be endorsing a strict causal determinism that assumes that this is the way things really are underneath it all. And he also endorses an experimental approach to evidence as providing, or at least it seemed to providing, a justified basis for belief formation. And that kind of experimental evidence assumes that there is underlying causality in the world, and there are external objects independent of the human mind. Otherwise, why would more evidence for something provide greater justification? If so there are a few things throughout the book that sort of raised a bit of attention in my mind as to what Hume was really committed to and what Hume was really saying. And then getting to the end of the book and hearing him really take these radical skeptical doubts seriously and sort of saying, well, they're right. There is no reasonable way out of this. We just kind of pack up and go home. We stop philosophizing after a while, and we have to go out and live our day-to-day lives with these groundless, non-rational assumptions that we just adopt because there's no other way out of it. Seems kind of unsatisfying and in tension with some of the other statements and some of the other assumptions that seem to be interwoven throughout Hume's work. So this turns out to be a matter of some debate amongst Humean scholars. Old Hume scholars, on the one hand, see this kind of traditional reading of Hume as a radical skeptic as the correct one, and basically they sort of say, well, Hume gets to the end of his project and is forced to, through sheer honesty, concede that there's no way out and concede a kind of helplessness in the whole thing. In that sense, Hume kind of fails to do what he set out to do, and admits that, and is forced to admit that. On the other hand, there's the new Humean scholars who see Hume as a skeptical realist, and they see Hume as not only not conceding defeat to this idea of radical skepticism, that Hume did believe in causality as existing in the world and the existence of objects external to the mind, and that he believed that he thought these beliefs were justified, that they had some kind of basis for them. So that's the state of play between the two. So in this presentation, I'm just going to give a rough sketch of both sides of this and just discuss some of my thoughts on these. There's a lot of nuanced positions on either side with regards to these readings, and a lot of really sort of in-depth scholarship. I'm not going to be able to do any justice to that in the 20 minutes here, or and really I'm still getting my head around a lot of it as well. So this is as much an exploratory experiment for me as it is a presentation. So bear that in mind. Okay, so I won't spend too much time here, but here is just some ideas why I feel like we might consider Hume a radical skeptic. So we might put him in this old Hume camp. And one of them is his theory of ideas. So we've spoken about that a lot throughout the unit, and I mentioned it just before about this idea that we get our ideas from impressions, and that in order to determine whether an idea is meaningful and has content, we need to look for the impression to which it refers, and if we can't find one, then it's meaningless and get rid of it. So on this account, and like Hume has sort of spent a long time explaining to us, we have no impression of causal connection. We have no impression of causality. All we have is really this conjunction that through force of habit we add this idea of causality to it. But because there's no impression of it, there's no legitimate rational basis for this causal connection that we make. And so Hume doesn't even attempt to provide any kind of justification for this kind of inductive reasoning, this kind of making predictions based on the past, predictions about the future based on the past, and reading this kind of causal necessity into things. He doesn't even try to defend it on any rational grounds. He rejects the possibility of doing so. He says that it's an instinct that we can't avoid doing. And yeah, like I said, so in section 12, Hume really does seem to take seriously these kinds of extreme skeptical doubts about the existence of the external world, and about whether we could read causation into it. He takes them seriously and seems to concede defeat to them. So I mean, all of these seem to really put Hume in a position as a radical skeptic, as someone who really questions any kind of basis, any kind of justification for any kinds of claims or any kind of knowledge. And now some reasons why we might consider Hume a skeptical realist. So I think Hume does make a couple of normative statements about inductive reasoning. So, I mean, Hume's famous comment that a wise man apportions his belief to the evidence. This seems like a normative claim. It's not just describing what we do. It's sort of prescribing what we should do. And if this is the case, then Hume seems to be assuming that there are better and worse beliefs based on this evidential reasoning. So the more evidence, and he says this, the more evidence we have for a particular claim, the more likely it is that we believe it. But not just the more likely it is that we believe it, but he seems to make the normative claim that this is how we should go about making such kind of evidential reasoning, is that we should weigh the evidence. And this kind of reasoning itself seems to rely on an assumption of both objects existing external to the mind and that there is a genuine causal connection between things that is underlying it all. Because it seems to be making the claim that if we can have better and worse beliefs, then the reason why they are better and worse is because good beliefs get closer to the true underlying nature of things, and bad beliefs aren't as close or are further away in the opposite direction. So it seems to, really rest on this assumption of external bodies existing and also as causality existing, because otherwise, on what basis if my experience is all that we're going on, why does more evidence matter either way? It would be just as baseless, as anything. So again, in the final paragraph, in Hume's famous comment about what kinds of reasoning should be committed to the flames and what's perhaps spared from the flames, Hume seems to suggest that this kind of experimental reasoning is legitimate and worthwhile. And one of the big reasons I think is that Hume's project overall, he's not engaging in deductive quantitative reasoning here. He's making a whole bunch of inductive claims about what we do and about how the mind works and so on and so forth. On what basis are we to believe Hume? On what basis are we to find him convincing? If there's no solid basis to inductive inference, then why should we take anything that Hume says as what motivates us to believe him either way or to be persuaded by him either way? But more importantly, what motivates him to undertake the project in the first place? I mean, if he's an extreme skeptic about the possibility of any kind of knowledge and the illegitimacy and baselessness of any kind of inductive claims about the world, then his project doesn't even get off the ground in the first place. So why does he engage in it? So one of the explanations for that might be like I spoke before about the old humouring being basically that he gets to the end and goes, well, turns out I couldn't do what I set out to do, therefore I'll pack up and go home. That wouldn't really explain why Hume was so insistent on writing the inquiry after releasing the treatise, and refining his ideas and really wanting to get them out to people and to, so if you guys want to pause now, and maybe it's up to you guys, you can do this now or at the end if you want to pause and add any reasons for or against these ideas that you guys might have, or it's up to you, but I'll move on. Okay, so coming back to the old and new Hume distinction here, is that, like I said, there's a lot of nuanced positions on either side, but there seems to be a running thread between the two, and that is that this possible distinction between ontological claims and epistemological claims. And so old Humeans argue that Hume's emphasis on our epistemological limitations leads him to necessarily reject any kind of positive ontological claim. So we only know our experience, we're entirely limited by that. We can't really say anything about the true nature of things because all we have is our experience. And so that kind of limitation leads us to reject ontology or metaphysics entirely. And that seems consistent with Hume's admonishing of rationalist philosophers who try to extend their reasoning beyond experience into realms of metaphysical speculation and into areas that really have no basis in experience and are what Hume considers quite fanciful and speculative. So the New Humeans, I think, take this distinction between the ontological claims and epistemological claims a little more seriously, in that they think that while on the one hand Hume highlights our epistemological limitations, we can't know anything about the way the world really is, that doesn't stop him from saying that we can have justified ontological beliefs about things. And so on this account, not only can we have such beliefs about the real nature of things without saying that we know or are certain of them, but the New Humeans claim that Hume actually is committed to a positive ontological claim about the existence of causation and the existence of objects and bodies external to the human mind. They say that Hume actually does hold this positive belief. So this is why Hume is considered by them a skeptical realist, because he's a realist in that he's committed to the positive ontological claim of the existence of objects and causations independent of the mind, but he's a skeptic because he denies the possibility of us actually knowing the true nature of those things. So it's a contrast between what we can know and what we can believe, and that difference I'll talk a bit more about later. But that seems to be important to the New Humean position, whereas the old Humean position really takes at face value this idea that because we can't know anything, our beliefs aren't justified either. There's no rational basis upon which we can say that one belief is stronger than the other. Therefore, we're committed to Hume is committed to a strong skeptical position. Okay, so the old Hume reaction to this idea that we can hold, and Hume does have a positive ontological belief about the existence of causation, is to say, well, look, that pretty explicitly violates his theory of ideas. Hume has really meticulously gone to great lengths to explain to us that there is no impression from which we derive this idea of causal necessity or causal connection. That really the only impression we have is of conjunction. So now turning around and saying, well, Hume, in spite of this, holds a positive belief in causation and causality as existing in the world, it really just violates explicitly the theory of ideas that he's painstakingly sort of laid out. So that would seem to be a pretty major thing. Either Hume is really holding a rather extreme set of double standards here, or there are exceptions to the theory of ideas. And this is one of the responses by New Humean scholars. So in particular, Strawson here talks about this notion of referent ideas. And I got to admit, I'm still trying to sort of get my head around what he means by this, because it seems really sort of tricky and running into some dangerous ground here in terms of the rest of Hume's theories. But Strawson basically says, Strawson points to Hume's discussion about our assumption of the existence of external objects. So Hume talks about this as being, well, look, it's a matter of fact either way as to whether objects exist external to the mind. We can't know either way. But Strawson says this idea that it is a matter of fact means that the idea of objects as existing external to the mind is an intelligible one. It's we can conceive of it in a meaningful way without necessarily being committed in terms of knowing it. So Hume sort of talks about this this referent this referent idea of the body's existing external to the mind as being imperfect, and Strawson points to that word imperfect and says, well, if Hume thinks that that's imperfect, then presumably there is something perfect to which it refers. So this kind of referent relationship assumes something to which the referent refers, so assumes the existence of external bodies, and Strawson says also assumes the existence of causality and a genuine underlying regularity in the universe that we gain this kind of conjunctive impression from. So I'm not sure I've got that completely right, and it's perhaps something I need to explore a little bit more. But one of the things that worries me a little bit about this step is that it really leaves open this idea of unobservables as serving a legitimate role in our reasoning. So the difficulty is that it really bumps up against this. Hume cautions us about reading more into the effect than is reading more into the cause of something than is in the effect. So if we're doing this reasoning from effect to cause and then back down again and adding something, then that's illegitimate, like he talks about with the kinds of arguments for God from intelligent design. So in this situation, the effect is this referent idea that we have of causality, except the effect, when we look at it closely, is really just a conjunction. And if we're then sort of taking this referent idea, which is the effect, and reading more into the cause, which is supposedly this underlying genuine regularity of the universe or genuine causality in the universe, we're really doing this kind of reasoning back down and adding something to it, which is what Hume has warned us against from the beginning. I just think this idea of referent ideas really, again, it's not clear why this particular referent idea gets a pass card from the Hume's insistence on the theory of ideas. So some difficulties there, I think. But there is another sort of reply to this. Sorry, I've sort of hidden the title under there. Apologies. There is another sort of reply that the New Humanes say with this violation of the theory of ideas, and that is to say that there are a particular class of beliefs that hold a special status for Hume, and that these class of beliefs are what's called natural beliefs. And these natural beliefs, they're immediate, they're self-evident, they're indispensable. There's no possible way we can actually do without them. They're really naturally ingrained in us as a species. They're universal. Every human being adopts these kinds of deeply ingrained beliefs as a way of navigating the world, and that doing without them is not an option. So some of the New Humane scholars claim that belief in causality is one of these beliefs, that it's indispensable and core to the human experience, non-rational, no rational basis for it, but inescapable and indispensable. And this kind of gels with Hume's talk about, once we take off our philosopher's cap, all of these doubts and these problems sort of dissipate, and we Hume in the treatise talks about how he goes and hangs out with his friends and plays backgammon and chills out and doesn't worry about it anymore. It's only when he starts really applying this kind of philosophical exploration and extreme application of reason to these problems that they become problems. So that's the idea of these natural beliefs. Winkler, who is an old Humean scholar, sort of says, well, look, that might be a description of what we do, but that doesn't necessarily justify the belief. And it doesn't say anything about whether Hume felt that belief was justified. And Hume really doesn't seem to try and provide any kind of justification for it, other than, look, it's something we do, which doesn't seem like as much a justification as it is another description of the way things just are. Winkler says that far from this idea of natural beliefs being justified positive ontological claims, really this idea that Hume emphasizes about nature being the only basis for these beliefs is that it commits Hume to remaining agnostic on the question, and by extension on the question of causal realism, and that's the only reading we can give to Hume on that. And I think that's, that gels with Hume's lack of justification for any kind of causal reasoning, and at the end of the day, he doesn't set out any clear criterion for what a natural belief might be, for why these beliefs, aside from the fact that they're inescapable, why they're justified in any way. He really doesn't even attempt to provide that. And it's sort of on these new Humean scholars who subscribe to this idea of natural beliefs to then come and give us an account of what counts as a natural belief and what doesn't count as a natural belief, and why, and so on and so on. So you would think that if Hume was pinning these kinds of positive claims about the world on this idea of natural beliefs as a way of justifying them, then he would perhaps be a little bit more explicit about what counted as these kinds of natural beliefs. I think it also puts us on really dangerous ground. I mean, Hume has spent his whole project sort of denying this the rationalist approach that tries to discover these self-evident truths that are certain and that are inescapable and that are a solid foundation upon which we can then make other claims about the world or about truth. Hume has gone to great lengths to dismantle any notion that this is a project that is possible or even worth undertaking. He rejects it outright. To then turn around and sort of say, well, to then turn around and sort of do the same thing but in a different way. He's sort of, instead of pinning these self-evident truths and these deductive basis upon which we can, this self-evident basis upon which we can deduce other claims on reason and rationality, Hume's just pinning it on human nature. And really, is there any substantial difference between the two? We're still expected to accept these positive ontological claims just because there's no way around it, because they're self-evident truths, capital T, certainty, truth. And I think that really runs counter to Hume's broader project, and so really raises some questions about it as a convincing way to sort of justify any sort of positive ontological claims that Hume's supposedly making. So at this stage, I just want to sort of raise a couple of loose thoughts in a possible essay direction that I have. Emphasize strongly that these are loose thoughts. I have some real doubts about whether this is a fruitful line of inquiry. So any feedback or anything like that, or any objections you guys have, put them into the forum post and send them to me, or bail me up at uni and let me know, because I'm really sort of tentative about this area. But one of the things I was thinking about was this distinction between knowledge and belief. So, Hume, like I said, has spent a long time sort of dismantling this idea that we can have any sort of certain truth about existence and about the world. And he talks about deductive reasoning as the only basis for certain knowledge, because it's definitional, because the conclusion is embedded in the premise, it's causally necessary, it's an enclosed system. But because it's an enclosed system that is definitional, it really has nothing and no application to existence. Claims about existence are probable claims. And in this sense, we might on the one hand take that kind of knowledge as being certain knowledge that the rationalist philosophers were all after, and belief as being probable knowledge, in that we apportion our belief to the evidence, and more evidence makes something more probable, more likely to be the case, but never certain. We can never have certain knowledge about existence, but that doesn't mean that we can't have better and worse beliefs, like I sort of mentioned before. So on this account, if this is what Hume is saying, and Hume is saying that this kind of evidential reason is epistemically worthwhile, and he seems to be saying that, and certainly in the final paragraph of section 12, then our experience of causality and the way that this assumption of causal connection and regularity in the universe as genuinely existing independent of our minds, and as something that we can approximate more or less based on different evidence and different and repeated experience. This is a good candidate for really the most justified belief that we can hold, because it has the most evidence. It's literally the basis upon which we have experiences in the first place. So, in terms of not being able to make any positive ontological claim, we maybe Hume isn't committed to saying that we can. He might remain essentially technically agnostic, particularly when wearing the philosopher's hat. We remain agnostic about any kind of positive ontological claim about the existence of causality, but we can still hold better beliefs. And one of the best beliefs that we can hold is, with the most evidence, is the idea of regularity and causal connection in the universe. Again, I'm not so sure about this. I think it's one of the things I like about this is it doesn't commit this kind of belief or positive claim about causation in the world as to being a kind of special kind of belief or a self-evident truth, which I think is, like I was saying before, really butts up against Hume's broader project. It doesn't sort of separate it out as this is a special kind of belief and therefore it's justified as a truth or a positive claim, a positive ontological claim. Really, it just fits in with this idea that we're just conditioned. But the more evidence we have for something, the stronger that conditioning. And the more evidence we have for something based on the more experience we have of it, the more justified we are in believing in it. And so it makes it a stronger belief by degree, not a different belief, not a special kind of belief. But the problem that I think arises for me, and like I say, I sort of need to explore this line of reasoning a little bit more, is that we still butt up against this problem of the theory of ideas that there's no impression from which we're supposed to get this idea of causal connection. So it's still not essentially based on experience, and therefore how can it be meaningful? And I'm not sure whether it's not essentially the same as Strawson's argument about a referent idea in that case. So, like I say, any feedback or anything like that would be great. I hope I haven't rambled too much or spoken too quickly, or I hope things have been at least somewhat clear, and where they haven't, that's certainly my fault and not the fault of the old and new Humean scholars who do some really cool scholarship and work on this, and it's really been interesting to read. So I guess in conclusion, one of the big differences here is really a question about the scope of Hume's skepticism, and whether it is extended to claims about how the world really is, like whether it's all encompassing in terms of like the radical skepticism of the old Humeans, or whether Hume's skepticism is really a kind of moderating skepticism, which is really designed not to undermine the possibility of any knowledge about the existence or about the world, or undermine any kind of justification for beliefs about the world, but is really just supposed to temper. On the one hand, it's really designed to deny any kind of certain claims about existence and about the world, but on the other hand, it's also really a way of tempering the kinds of claims that we can make and are justified in making, and saying that if we do want to make or hold certain beliefs about the world, that we would do better to justify them through evidence. Okay, so yeah, some of the questions I had would you add or subtract anything to the list that I had before? What's gained and what's lost on either the old or the new Hume reading, and doesn't matter? Which reading do you find more convincing? And I think this is an interesting question, is what other kinds of beliefs might Hume consider natural beliefs if we do accept this idea of natural beliefs? God, for instance, or even this idea of libertarian free will, which really seems indispensable to the way we live our lives and the way we operate with it, and seems to be an idea that Hume really considers to be mistaken, but whether or not that would also classify as a natural belief under this understanding of natural beliefs. Cool. So, any questions, or certainly would love feedback or any criticisms or anything like that. Chuck them in the forums, and cool. Thanks.